We all know how history remembers the great leaders. But behind the statues and the stories, what were they actually like? Hi, I'm your host, Emily Snow, and this is The Collector, where we explore the stories and ideas that shape art, history, and culture, one conversation at a time with the experts who know them best. Today, I'm pleased to be here talking with Dr. Paul Cartledge, one of the world's foremost scholars of ancient Greece.
So I'm going to speak for only half an hour. Oh, that got you worried.
He's really among the best qualified people to help us get to know the great leader Pericles. We'll also be discussing Paul's upcoming book titled Pericles, Statesman, Demagogue, Eccentric. To set the stage for us before we dive in, Pericles was a defining figure of Athens Golden Age. In the 5th century BCE, Pericles helped shape democracy, politics, art, and culture in ways that still resonate with us over 2,000 years later. But as Paul will show us, the story of Pericles the person is actually quite full of paradox. Paul, thank you so much for joining us today. Could you please start with a quick introduction of yourself?
Hello, I'm Paul Cartledge. I'm a senior research fellow of Clare College, Cambridge, and I'm retired from my chair of Greek culture. But I'm still, as we say over here, research active, including, of course, writing the book that we're about to talk about.
So, Paul, your career and your scholarship have focused primarily on ancient Athens as well as Sparta. What was it that originally drew you to this particular field of study?
It's a long story, Emily, and I'll not bore you with all of it. But I first of all got interested in the ancient Greeks when I was about 8. And I read told to the children versions of both the Iliad and the Odyssey, the epics of Homer. I then went to the kind of school where if you were any good at languages, even ancient languages, so Greek and Latin, you were pushed into the classical scholarship stream. So from the age of 8, I learned Latin. From the age of 11, I learned Greek. And I went to Oxford to do classics. And then I did my doctorate there. And I've been in various universities since 70 odd, really. I've been full-time teaching, and I retired 2014. So my love of the ancient world, ancient Greek especially, goes back, I'm afraid, very, very many decades.
Pericles, Statesman, Demagogue, Eccentric certainly seems to be a culmination of your decades of study and passion in the field. The book is being billed as a nuanced portrait of Pericles. So can you tell us a bit about your research and writing process for the book? How did you go about creating a biography of such a complex figure?
I've studied Pericles ever since the 1960s, and with special emphasis since the 1970s. And here I am, I'm an editor of a series called Great Lives of the Ancient World. And so it seemed to me Pericles' life, it's being called the great life. Though there are, of course, people who think that anyone who's great, think about Alexander the Great or Charlemagne or Napoleon, they're not all entirely good. And I think that's one issue we might be coming back to. But the reason that I wanted to do this in particular was, it's a fairly obvious point, but the way the world has gone in terms of, in particular, democracy, in particular, Western democracy. So I wrote a book not so long ago about democracy from antiquity to the present time. And of course, I dealt with Pericles there. But what I've been able to do here is drill down a bit more deeply. And you listed the 3 dimensions, which we're going to talk about. And they are the subtitle of the book. And the idea is really to try to bring him, in a sense, to life. I mean, it's a truism, but the ancients, unlike us, didn't go in for social media. They didn't write diaries, autobiographies. So we're looking always from the outside. And Pericles flourished in the 5th century BC. That's what we call the 400s BC, BCE. So about 2,500 years ago, when imaginably different, unimaginably different. Just think about, as I say, no remote means of communication as we just at this minute are communicating with each other.
So when we talk about Pericles, we of course tend to also talk about democracy. Pericles is celebrated for fostering Athenian democracy, but some of his actions have been described as more tyrannical than democratic. Paul, how would you describe Pericles' contributions as a statesman? And at the same time, what makes him a demagogue?
I'll start with etymology. Our word democracy means literally demos, people, and kratos, power. So it's people power. And then the question is, okay, what people, which people? And for the ancient Greeks, it meant just males. I'm afraid women, and of course sub-adults, minors, and unfree people. Remember, the ancients had many slaves living and working and actually doing absolutely critical functions in their society. So we're left with a relatively small percentage. It's estimated about 15% of the total population of the city of Athens and its surrounds in about 500 BCE. These were only 15% were adult, male, fully empowered citizens. But, and this is really the point of my book and point of my talk now, uniquely in about 500 BC, which is shortly before Pericles was born, he was born in about 495 BC, Athens uniquely empowered a higher percentage of the adult male free population than any other Greek city, for the simple reason Athens invented a form of people power, gave it the word democracy, demokratia in ancient Greek, modern Greek as well, of course, and that is the fountain origin of all democracies. Though, and then of course one adds a rider, a qualification, modern democracy, every modern one is different qualitatively from every ancient one, because ancient ones were direct. In order to do democracy, you had to turn up, you had to vote in person, you had to listen in person. Whereas all modern forms of democracy since the late 18th century, especially from the late 19th century, they are, of course, representative. We elect representatives who do democracy for us, whether in a presidential system such as the United States or France, or in a parliamentary system such as the United Kingdom. But of course, the United Kingdom's slightly odd. We have a king, a crown, and democracy in the ancient world was seen as the opposite of one-man rule. And we'll come back to one aspect of that contradiction. So what about Plato? What about Plato? There's a kind of Freudian slip, but on the other hand, he is a main witness to the negative side of democracy. So imagine you hated democracy and you don't think the masses, ordinary people, maybe ignorant, illiterate even, should have any say in politics, let alone power. Then you would become an anti-democrat, and Plato is one of those. So though Plato and Pericles were very nearly contemporary, one died immediately before the other was born, they were diametrically opposite. Anyway, so as I say in my subtitle, I started out with Statesman, which is rather grand, and it makes anybody who's called a statesman seem rather above the rough and tumble of, let's say, personal politics or party politics. By the way, there were no parties in the modern sense in the ancient world. And that is indeed how one of our major sources, a historian has to have evidence, and we are lucky. We have a contemporary historian, a man called Thucydides, and he presents Thucydides chiefly as a statesman, and his point is to contrast him with the run-of-the-mill leaders of politics, the people who spoke up, people who directed policy within the Athenian democracy. And for them, there was a much less favorable, polite term. It's an ancient term, and it has a modern an analog, and that is demagogos, which is demagogue. And demagogue typically means somebody who uses rhetoric in a bad way in order to rouse up passion and emotion as opposed to reason. So what I try to do, it's a bit of a balancing act in my book, is say, on the one hand, Pericles was, as Thucydides says, rational, reasonable, not a crowd pleaser or rabble rouser. But in order to get his policies through, to persuade the masses to vote for him, he had to be eloquent, he had to be persuasive, and therefore he needed to use rhetorical tricks, inevitably. Remember that in an assembly, you've got 5,000-6,000 people sitting around on the top of a hill, the Pnyx, in the middle of winter it might be, and you've got to hold them, and you've got to put across a policy, persuade them to vote for him. So he was both a statesman and a demagogue. And we're going to come back, I think, to Eccentric, the third of my trinity.
So among the many different realms and methods of political influence that Pericles had on Athens, I think it's especially interesting and important to note that Pericles shaped not only the function of democracy, but also its aesthetic form, most notably including the Parthenon. So can you tell us a bit about how and why Pericles was so invested in the art and architecture of Athens?
So Pericles was what we'd call not only an intellectual, but also an aesthete. One of his pals, he had a wide range of associates, some of whom he actually worked actively with to get measures passed by the assembly. But one of them was one of those persons who benefited from the assembly deciding to make a decision on building and then commissioning particular artists and craftsmen. And this is a guy called Phidias, or in Greek Phidias, who was a sculptor, basically, but also it's thought a designer, that is a sculptural architect who worked out schemes of sculpture. And of course, his most famous contribution is to the sculptural program of the Parthenon, which you mentioned. Now, in order for any building to be constructed on the Acropolis, which is a most sensitive site, religious, political, in the entirety of ancient Athens, you have to get the people in a democracy presented with a program, an idea, and for them to vote by majority vote, counting of the hands that they raised to support it. Then you have to have a follow-up bill, which is how much money shall we devote to it, and whom shall we commission to actually do the, in this case, sculptural program and the actual architecting. So the Parthenon itself, not only is it, of course, probably one of the most famous buildings ever, and in terms of its proportions, one of the most perfect. It's, of course, in a rather ruinous state today, but it's also a thoroughly democratic building in the sense that it was the Athenian democracy led by Pericles that decided to build it. So somebody had to, and we don't know whether it was Pericles. All we can say is for sure Pericles supported the notion. And we know that he was particularly interested in finance. So he might even possibly have had a hand in the commission, which was specially selected to manage the project, because you can't just vote for something and then say, go on, guys, do it. But somebody's got to take in hand the dishing out of the public money, the controlling of the contract, and the seeing that there's labor available, materials available, all these things, quite extraordinary project. So yes, sometimes people today think, well, because Pericles almost certainly was directly connected with the Parthenon, he must therefore have been connected with other buildings, because actually in the middle of the 5th century BC, the 440s and onwards, the second half, from the 440s to the 410s, Athens built several major temples, instructed architects and sculptors to construct, to build, to fashion major sculptures, including Phidias. So there was what's called a building program which was not only on the top of the Acropolis, but also down at the foot of it in what's called the Agora, or civic centre. All of which comes about, just very briefly to situate it, the Persians had come at the beginning of the 5th century, 490, 480s, and destroyed everything they found on the top of the Acropolis. Of course, for Greeks, that was sacrilege. It wasn't just an act of war. It was an act of defiance or disrespect of their gods and goddesses. The Athenians then waited something like 30 years until they'd amassed enough money to do what they considered to be justice to their gods and goddesses, especially Athena. And so the Parthenon becomes the centerpiece of this extraordinary burst of creation on the top of the Acropolis.
So we've covered Pericles' influence all the way from politics to the Parthenon, but now I want to dive even more deeply into the personal side of Pericles. How does understanding what you have called the eccentric aspects of Pericles expand our view of him?
My point here really is twofold, that he was eccentric both politically and personally. Now, in a way, if you're a leading politician in any city, your private life at any period is somewhat relevant to how you function on the public political stage, whether or not you're able to function. For example, your home life is not irrelevant, but Pericles' family, that is his natal family, and then the family that he himself developed, are both in their different ways eccentric. Well, let's go back to his birth. His mother, was the niece of the man the Athenians regarded as, in a way, the founding father of the Athenian democracy, a man called Cleisthenes. But Cleisthenes, there was a little bit of a problem. His mum and his father had been descended from a tyrant. Now, in Greek, a tyrant doesn't necessarily mean a terribly bad ruler, a vicious autocrat. It means someone who rules as a sole person based on force, but you can be, as it were, a benevolent despot. You're not necessarily a really nasty one. So Cleisthenes' grandfather was fairly benevolent, but he wasn't Athenian. So Pericles' ancestry contains a non-Athenian sole ruler, whereas, now this is my point, the democracy of Athens set itself up as the antithesis of tyranny. They actually had they called them heroes, and they put up statues of them in the Agora, the civic centre I mentioned, and they called them the tyrant slayers. There's a complicated story behind them, which I won't go into, but the point is they were emblematic of the new political regime, this actually originary democracy, which is anti-tyranny. So Pericles had an eccentric family background. But what's much more obvious, and this is really why I put it in the title of the book, he first of all married an upper-class Athenian woman. This is absolutely standard. Greek men, especially aristocrats, wealthy, well-born, well-educated, they would have an arranged marriage, typically with a distant relative, or at any rate with another aristocratic woman in their late 20s. Greek men typically married in their late 20s. Pericles did all that. It's a sign of our ignorance. We don't know the name of his wife. We do know the names of both his children with that wife, and both of them were boys, and we know a little bit about their subsequent lives. He then divorced that first wife. Now, again, nothing particularly unusual about He'd produced 2 kids, he'd done his duty, he'd secured the continuity of his family line, and we know that he was a workaholic, a politico-holic, if you like, who spent every waking day pretty much in this phase of his life thinking about politics. And he was a politician on the make when he divorced. He wasn't yet at the peak of his authority and influence. Well, in the period as he's leading up to that eminence, leading up to the building of the Parthenon and so on, he meets and marries or lives with. There's a bit of a debate as to whether his living with her counted as a formal marriage. A lady from another Greek city called Miletus on the other side of the Aegean in what's now Turkey. And her name is Aspasia or Aspasia. Her name means something like in English, joy. And his relationship with Aspasia was thought to be as eccentric as possible. She was a smart woman. She had a kind of salon at which intellectuals would come to visit their joint home and talk about the latest intellectual ideas, philosophy, theatre, medicine, whatever. And she was recognized as being what we now say, a power behind the throne, except that Pericles hadn't got a throne, but you know what I mean. And as such, she became a target. And it may seem strange, but there was no social media. There were no ways in which you're immediately having a go at a politician, smearing him. But every year, the Athenians celebrated a couple of theatre festivals. And comedy was very unlike tragedy. It was a free-for-all. And it was about contemporary people and politics, whereas tragedy was typically about myth set in the distant past. So Aspasia became a means, a vehicle for people who either didn't like Pericles or resented him or envied him or just wanted to have a go at him, for the sake of satire and caricature. So they invented a kind of Aspasia who ran a brothel. They invented an Aspasia who's the real power behind the throne. She was the one who came up with the ideas that Pericles put forward. They weren't his, they were really Aspasia's. So he resisted completely these insults and attacks, and he carried on blithely as if almost nothing had happened. He was unshaken by these really quite vicious attacks, but it doesn't correspond with our modern image of Pericles the statesman, that his private life should be so unorthodox and eccentric, and therefore he should be so abused on the public stage.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate how you've shed light on the many different facets of Pericles as a statesman, a demagogue, and an eccentric, as the title of your book describes him. Speaking of which, can you tell us more about how you've tried to present all of these facets of Pericles in the creation of this book?
Well, one of the things that preoccupy me is methodology. That's to say, I'm a historian. What counts as writing a biography of an ancient figure? Well, I'm not the first to write a biography of Pericles. There's a very famous one written by Plutarch, who lived, though, about 400-500 years after Pericles. So what he had to do is what I do. He had to look back at previous written sources and then try to make of what he read a picture. However, whereas Plutarch was interested in moral biography, so what ethical lessons can we draw from learning about the life of Pericles, both public and private? I, on the other hand, am a historian, and though ethics, morality is part of the story, it's not the primary motive. What I'm trying to do is explain and understand. And so when I write a biography of Pericles, because there are no diaries, no social media, whatever, I have to write an external biography, what I call a life and times biography. So in my book, you'll find quite a lot about the times as opposed to just about Pericles. But what then I have to confront is what difference did Pericles' life make to the times? So we look at the interaction. Plutarch wasn't interested in that. He just took the facts as he saw them straight and then said, oh, yes, well, there's a moral lesson, or there's something not to do. So there's a lesson in what to avoid as opposed to what to imitate. Well, I don't have any such ethical ambitions.
One last question for you, Paul. Can you please tell us more about when and how your book is being published? And is there anything that you hope today's readers will take away from your book that pre-existing texts on Pericles might not necessarily offer?
It will be published by Reaction Books of London in the middle, sort of May, June 2026, in a series that I edit called The Great Lives of the Ancient World. The ancient world includes Rome as well as Greece. It includes China and India as well as the Greco-Roman Mediterranean. And what the point of it, I mean, insofar as I'm wanting to achieve one aim, it's to reposition Pericles within his various contexts that we've looked at, political, domestic, aesthetic, because I have slightly different takes on all of those from, shall we say, some standard views. But more importantly, I think it's to be read, or at least I would like it to be read, in the same way my democracy book was written some now 8 years ago and then reissued, which is so that people will rethink the meaning of the word democracy, the meaning of the word statesman, the meaning of demagogy, if you like, mobocracy, all sorts of words are used. But what exactly should we mean by people power today in relation to, and so that our ideas can be refined by contrast to, the ways in which the Athenians did democratic politics, led by Pericles, misled by Pericles, as people such as Plato thought, because they fundamentally disagreed with the notion of direct rule by ordinary people who might be poor, ignorant, fickle, not, as it were, well equipped to understand the political process or the issues of the day. And today there are so many different, we talk about pluralism, ways in which politics is delivered, if that's the right word. But one of the ways in which most of us never do democratic politics is actually to be elected to an office and to be therefore subject to audit, to scrutiny, to recall, to, as it were, have to defend oneself as well as one's policies. And I personally, I would find that rather daunting, but I'm very keen on us, the majority, fulfilling our necessary function of keeping our elected representatives in order. And of course, we have a regular check via elections, but I personally would rather I would hope we could try to manage to introduce some sort of more popular intervention on a more regular basis. And of course, that brings up the issue of plebiscites or referendums, which we in this country, we've had a couple in the last 15 years or so, not with, I think, great success, but they're at any rate an attempt to devolve power down as far as it's legitimately thought to go. In other words, as far as the competence of ordinary people can go. So, in a way, my Pericles book is a kind of object exercise, a sample of what a direct democracy can be like and how different that is. On the other hand, there are dimensions of ancient Athenian democracy which I think could usefully be incorporated in our modern democracies. I mentioned referendums, plebiscites. Another way is by use of the lottery for either allocating public funds or indeed, if you have a revising chamber as well as the primary legislature, which of course course, we have in this funny thing called the House of Lords. I think some lords and ladies should be selected by the lottery, but that's a complicated and it's a controversial suggestion, but it comes directly from the Athenians' use of the lottery in the 5th century BC.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's been awesome to peel back the layers of Pericles with you. And of course, congratulations on your new book.
Well, it was absolutely great to meet and talk with you. Thank you for having me on your program.
In the meantime, if you want to check out more histories like this one, visit thecollector.com. You can find fresh insights into ancient Greece and thousands, literally thousands of other topics.